I'd like to welcome everyone to the Finance and Risk Management Committee for the San Diego Community Power Board of Directors meeting on March 16th, 2023. Clerk, can you go to the call?
Okay, roll call. Imperial Beach representative,
Here.
La Mesa representative.
Here.
Chula Vista representative. We have a quorum.
Great, thank you so much. Do we have any public comments?
There are no written public comments.
Are there any changes to the agenda?
No.
Great. So we're gonna move on to our first agenda item, which is the approval of February 9th, 2023 meeting minutes. Do I have a motion?
I'll move to approve.
I'll second that.
Director Parent, how do you vote?
Aye.
Director Aguirre, how do you vote?
Aye.
Motion carries with all directors voting yes.
Great. Now we're gonna move to item number 2. We'll review of treasurer's report for period ending in January 31st, 2023.
Thank you, Chair Gary, Councilmember Parent, thank you for being here. I'm Dr. Eric Washington, and I'll be presenting this item. I'd like to also, at this moment, introduce the finance team for San Diego Community Power. Tim McLemont, our finance manager, and Chris Doe, our financial analyst for the finance department here at San Diego Community Power. So we'll be presenting a recommendation to receive and file the treasurer's report as of the period ending July 31st, 2023, which marks 7 months year to date in our fiscal reporting cycle. Next slide, please. So for the period, year to date period ending January 31st, 2023, overall, our results as it compares to the budget was pretty much on par, performed fairly well with respect to our actual net revenues compared to where we budgeted. We came in 7 percentage points over budget, and our operating expenses came in at 6% over budget. So offset by the over budget portion of the net operating revenues. Looking at the total revenue for the period, we reported $491 million compared to, or I'm sorry, in terms of expenses, we reported 490. Sorry. So let me back up. I'm sorry. So we reported $491 million in operating revenue compared to the $456 million we budgeted for. Operating expenses came in at $776 million compared to the $449 million per se we budgeted for in terms of total expenses, landing us in a actual net position of $15 million compared to the $8.1 million we budgeted for. So landing approximately $7 million in terms of net position over the budget. So the chart, the bar chart on the lower right-hand portion of this slide just represents graphically our actual results compared to our budgeted results. Next slide, please. So this slide represents a comparative analysis of our actual results as it related to our pro forma or projection. So you'll see in this slide, we came in pretty much break even in terms of net revenues. Operating expenses came in lower than we actually projected for, contributing to a net position over what we had actually projected year to date for the period. And again, the bar chart in the lower right-hand corner of this presentation graphically shows the actual results versus what we projected for the period. Next slide, please. So this slide is a depiction of where we landed with regard to contributions to reserves, looking at where we landed relative to our projected reserves or actual planned reserves. We were under our reserve target by about 57%. So that landed us 28% at our reserve goal in terms of where we met relative to where we had targeted. And so the reserves are actually made up of cash on hand. And then when we overlay that with access we had to the line of credit, this is a reflection of where we landed from access to liquidity standpoint. Next slide, please. This slide is a representation of a trend analysis in terms of how our reserves and access to lines of credit has changed over time, looking at the trend analysis beginning back in July 2022, which was the beginning of our fiscal cycle year to date through January 31st, 2023. The blue representing unrestricted cash, and the yellow or gold portion of the bars representing the access to our credit, how those have changed over time throughout the fiscal period. Next slide. So again, Madam Chair, we are seeking a recommendation from the Finance and Risk Management Committee that we advance the Treasurer's report to the upcoming board meeting for approval to receive and file under the consent calendar. That concludes my presentation for item 2.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from board members? I have just a quick question regarding the difference between the numbers in August to the ones in January. Is there a reason why that was higher than we were going?
Are you referring to the trend analysis?
Correct.
Yes. So that was, I believe that was a representation. Oh,
I'm just
it's
curious.
not-
And when do we expect to hit our goal? And we might have talked about that at the last board meeting, but just refresh my memory.
Yeah, we did. And we've actually got a slide in one of the upcoming presentations, which mark sort of the timeline to reach our reserve target. We'll sort of get to that. But give me a moment just to go back to the slide that you're referring to, the trend analyses. And Tim or Chris, if you've got any insight or any comments around it.
I could dive in. In August is when our summer rates kick in, and so we do make a lot of our money in summer rates. And then during the winter time, we do sometimes run pretty thin or negative. So that's gonna be the key difference.
That might be the usual cycle.
And that's sort of just the cyclical nature of sort of our rate dynamic, summer versus.
Okay, that makes absolute sense. Okay, thank you so much.
Yep.
Okay, we're gonna move on to item number 3, presentation of the proposed framework of the San Diego Community Power Investment Policy.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Kimberly, I'm sorry, were we supposed to do a roll call for item number 2?
No, there's no vote. I think that was a receive and file on.
Receiving file, okay, thank you. Sorry, just a point of correction. Thank you. Item number 3, I'll be presenting this item in conjunction with Chris Doe, our financial analyst. So we're presenting to the Finance and Risk Management Committee for receive and file a presentation of frameworks that we are going to be putting forward during this meeting for the investment policy that we're working to draft, as well as item number 4, our debt policies. So both of these policies will support our pursuit of an investment grade credit rating. So these policies will support that package as we move forward in terms of pursuing that credit rating. So specifically for item number 2, the investment policy, basically both of those policies were informed by 3 sources, looking at other CCAs and an analysis of their policies, looking at our member agencies and some of the policies that they have in place, as well as just best practices from a financial management standpoint. So one objective that we have in pursuit of these policies and overall fiscal management is really to make sure that we have financial stability. And so these strategies will promote long-term organizational stability. as we reach our reserve targets as well as pursue investment grade credit ratings. Next slide, please. So back in July of June 2022, we adopted a strategic plan. So the two arrows represent kind of where we are with regard to those strategic goals. One is to start to implement and develop financial controls and policies, which brings us to the introduction of the framework for the investment policy, as well as also putting us on the trajectory to pursue investment grade credit ratings. So according to the strategic plan, the target for achieving the investment grade credit rating was November 2025. And then the other two goals was to adopt a plan to achieve a reserve target, as well as develop a rate stabilization reserve and a target associated with that. Next slide, please. So this slide may be familiar to you, as this was a slide that was presented during our rate setting process back in January, where we showed that based on the action that the board took at the January board meeting, that moves our trajectory for achieving those strategic goals forward, meaning that based on that action, we now are looking to achieve that 90 days cash on hand in June of 2023, and possibly reaching the 180-day reserve target in October of 2023, which spills over into our fiscal year 2024 budget cycle. Next slide. So again, the investment policy was informed by an analysis of policies and procedures currently in place with some of our peers in the CCA space, as well as certain municipalities and member agencies that are in our program. And then again, overall best practices from fiscal standpoint. Next slide, please. So I will now turn it over to Chris Doe to take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, council members and mayor. Yes, pleasure to be here with you all. I'm Chris Doe, financial analyst with SDCP. I'll be presenting our framework for our investment policy here. We point attention to our slide. SDCP wants to make sure that we make sound investments that manage risk and most importantly, prevent losses. That will be regarding priority 1, which is safety. And priority 2 would be liquidity. SDCP will have 180 days of cash on hand in reserves and a credit facility to cover operating costs. We want to remain liquid in our investments to follow best financial practices and ensure SDCP meet and exceeds liquidity requirements. And priority 3 is return on investments. SDCP will design its investments portfolios by prioritizing safety and liquidity, but we still want to make a market rated return. Go on to the next slide, please. This slide here has an acceptable, regarding our acceptable investment types. These investment types are listed as acceptable amongst our current member agencies and other CCAs. Overall, these are considered low risk and highly liquid, and results, and we can go on to the prohibited. This slide here, these are a list of prohibited investment types we have in our policy, or we will have in our policy. The policy we don't want basis here. We do not want to invest in anything that is based purely on speculation. We want to stay away from these types of investments due to their nature to incur losses. We can probably add Bitcoin to this list. Good. Do we have any questions before I turn it over back to Dr. Washington?
Next slide, please. So again, one of the objectives of this policy will be that we have certain controls in place so that we make sure that as we pursue these relatively low risk, highly liquid type investment options, that we have proper controls in place. So this is a list of the controls that we will be recommending and moving forward in the policy draft to come. So these controls should not exceed the benefits that they're intended to provide. And the valuation of cost and benefits requires estimates and judgment by management. So the policy will also recommend support of third-party or external sources to help with the overall portfolio and investment management. And in conjunction with these controls and the overall investment objectives, the investment types, prohibited adjustments will also include under the control parameters monthly reporting. So this reporting will continue to be a portion of the treasurer's report that will be presented to the FRMC and ultimately to the board. And then on an annual basis, in conjunction with our financial audits that's currently being conducted by Percentage Brinker, an external CPA audit firm that tests our financials. And this will be an integral part, the investments will be an integral part of that test. Next slide, please. So again, this is a receive and file of a presentation for the framework of San Diego Community Power's proposed investment policy that will ultimately come back in a policy draft form at a future meeting for the Finance and Risk Management Committee. Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Washington. Do we have any questions or comments? I think it's interesting.
But I have to do it. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for this. I think the only thing that I wanted to just ask for, as the policy is being developed and brought back to the board for consideration, just to provide some, you kind of talked about this a little bit in the presentation, but the final policy to just have a little bit of share and help us understand the distinction between, you know, like you have a list of authorized types of investments, which I think are in state statute, right? And so like, you know, saying, okay, well, this is why we're doing this. It's from the state statute. And then I'd also like to know these are the additional policies or judgments that we're making that are, you know, on our discretion for those reasons, and help us understand the distinction between those, so that we can evaluate them and such.
Okay, thank you for the feedback.
That's a good comment. No, I agree. I think having that clarity is important. Thank you. All right, we'll move on to item number 4, presentation of the proposed framework for the San Diego Community Power Debt Policy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I'll be presenting this item. So we are recommending receive and file the presentation of the framework for the debt policy for San Diego Community. So largely due to the rising cost of energy, our projected reserves, this slide was also presented during our rate discussion back in January. Just by way of background, depicts how our reserve targets have actually changed since January of 2022 through December of 2022. And so with the rate setting action by the board back in January, that again moves forward the possibility for us hitting those reserve targets earlier than we had planned in our strategic plan. Next slide, please. So this again is a revisit of why do we want to build reserves? And so power purchase agreements, it gives us more leverage with regard to being able to negotiate better rates and better negotiation in terms of pricing for power purchase agreements. It contributes to rate stability. It provides long-term financial health. It also provides funding or resources for us to fund programs once we are up and running with our programs team. And so the issuance of debt will benefit us from a standpoint of being able to pursue debt at lower rates, lower cost of funds through public debt issuances. Next slide. And so back to the energy portfolio development, it provides reasonable prices for clean energy. It gives us better buying power with the, go back one slide, please. Thank you. Better buying power for electricity as we build our portfolio and procure energy to service our customers. Next slide. So this slide also represents goals that were set during our strategic planning session and potentially how a debt policy could contribute to us being able to procure energy to meet those procurement goals as outlined in the strategic plan. Next slide, please. So the development of this policy was also informed by policy analysis of peers, member agencies, and then just best financial practices. So the scope and the authority of this policy, it'll govern the issuance and the management of debt. There will be compliance. They will be in compliance with certain government codes, California government codes. Debt issuances, one source would be via the green bond to the extent possible, and other vehicles or other bond issuances that may have access to start to pursue debt in the public setting. The uses of the funds will be as outlined in this slide, possibly for acquisition of assets, the construction of assets, and a number of other things that would allow us to focus on ways that we might be able to reduce our energy costs on our own assets, as well as being able to reduce our cost of funds. Next slide. So this slide essentially, and I apologize for the small text, but it just outlines some of the various types of bonds and the terms that might be associated with those bonds. Next slide. And so two bonds that we intend to really give focus to are the tax exempt and the taxable bonds. These bonds will allow us, specifically the tax exempt bonds, to really be able to take advantage of some instruments and tools where we might be able to acquire energy and provide potential rate savings from the savings on the cost that we might be able to use these bonds to have to prepay for some of the energy costs or energy contracts that we currently have and future contracts potentially that pursue. So internally, the policy will provide some guide rails or some guardrails from a standpoint of making sure that we don't overextend the agency with regard to debt. And two of the examples we're using is to really set a guideline with regard to our revenue and the number of times our revenue should cover the debt and interest in terms of the debt service on those issued bonds or debt. And then also a percentage of the agency's operating expenses. So, for example, the debt service on the debt outstanding on an annual basis shouldn't exceed 5% of the total expenses for the agency. So that's another guide rail that we're looking to implement in the framework of the debt policy. Next slide. I'm going to ask Tim to speak to the example that's in the slide deck. So Tim.
Yeah, hi, Mayor Gay, Director Perrin, Tim Engelmont, Finance Manager for SDCP. So I want to give you guys an illustrative example of what an actual revenue bond issuance would look like for SDCP. Completely for example purposes, not saying we're going to do this, but if we were to do something, it could look like this. SCCP could, in theory, issue a $500 million revenue bond with our own ratepayer revenue pledged against it. If we were to do it today, it would be somewhere around 5 percentage points for the interest rate. Typically, when you do a revenue bond, you want that bond, the useful life of whatever you're building to follow the maturity date of the bond, with the idea being at year 20, then you can issue a new bond and replace it. So in this example, we're showing you what the debt service schedule would look like. So over the course of the 20 years, this would cost the agency around $800 million in just debt service and principal payments. And then thinking through the projected revenue and expense that we have for next fiscal year, these are numbers that we showed you previously with those projection slides. Kind of to what Director Perrin was talking about, those two bond tests that Dr. Washington mentioned are things not in state code or state statute. These are things that we want to impose on ourselves to be conservative. With the idea being looking at the revenue side, so pledge revenues, we don't want the annual debt service, so principal plus interest, to exceed. So 2 times that, we don't want that to exceed our pledge revenue for any given year. So on the right, you could see that bond test in particular, where for fiscal year 24, we anticipate having almost $1.3 billion in revenue. And in this scenario, the debt service cost for that 1 year is about $80 million. And so we blow that bond test out of the water. Like we don't get anywhere near not passing that bond test. So that's number one. I will say this bond test is pretty similar to it would be similar to a debt service covenant ratio that most people have. And this is one I think just across the finance board for most government agencies. Like this one is common to include, and this is pretty conservative. The second one that Dr. Washington mentioned was we don't want 5% of our operating expenses to exceed, or we don't want more than 5% of our operating expenses to be going towards debt service. And so for our next year's projection, we project to have about $974 million in expenses, and then 5% of that is about $48.7 million. And so we passed that bond test because that $48.7 million is more than the $40 million in just projected debt service costs for that year. So just kind of illustrative examples of something that could happen, and if we were to do a bond test that we're imposing on ourselves to be conservative, we would pass that bond test.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And so again, these are guardrails that would ensure that we don't reach a point where we're over leveraged from a debt perspective with regard to our overall financial stability. And so this would address one of the guiding principles of our finance team, is to make sure that we're being fiscally responsible and we operate a financially stable organization, and that we have the controls and the policies and procedures in place to make sure that we can remain safe and sound and not become over leveraged from a debt perspective. So next slide, please. And so again, this policy is a recommendation to receive and file by the Finance and Risk Management Committee. The strategy will be to actually solidify drafts of both policies, taking into consideration feedback from Councilmember Perrin and other feedback for both policies. Again, making sure that we can implement policies and controls to make sure that we are operating a sustainable and stable agency from that perspective, as well as leveraging our resources from an investment perspective. So that concludes the presentation on item 4. Madam Chair.
Do you have any comments, questions?
Yeah, just a couple. I mean, one, sort of saying, you guys already intuited, like the same comment that I had in the first one. It'd be good to hear in the final policy with clarity about what are the things we have to do under state statute and what are the things we're electing to do for whatever reasons. I was sort of, you don't have to have an answer now, and I don't have strong opinions one way or another, but I do wonder if we have these sort of percentages and sort of safeguards and that sort of things in the last slide, if those are like standard things for a lot of government agencies, great. But I do wonder if the structure of our finances are different, because like most government agencies, they have a certain amount of tax revenue they get, and that's, and there, but most of their size of their organization is like paying people to do things on their staff and that stuff. But we're really different, right? Like we have like ton of revenue, but like a ton of expenses, mostly just pass through. And then it's just, the size of the agency is actually much smaller than it kind of looks on sort of accounting, right? And so I wanted to make sure that that's kind of part of the thinking about what those 5% of $1 billion versus 5% of the $40 million we're spending on staff. I just think it's worth maybe you guys have some thoughts on that. And then the third thing was just you didn't say, I don't think it was in this presentation, but it was in the agenda document, being that we have perhaps a competitive advantage because we can get some lower interest rates and that sort of stuff, and competitive advantage with the private sector, and maybe that's a good reason to do that. And I just wonder if that's still true with the Inflation Reduction Act being in place, like with the scale of tax credits available to the private sector. Do they have the competitive advantage? And should our opinions about these things have evolved since that became the law? So anyway, I don't know if you don't have to have answers today if you don't, but those are some of the things that I'm be interested in thinking about and hearing from you all. It gets back to us.
Thank you for that, Councilman.
If I could comment.
Yeah, you have answers now. Yeah.
Yeah, so the three things that aren't in state statute are in here. The two that we mentioned, the pledge revenues, the annual debt service, those two were tests that we had. Plus, we also added green bonds, which essentially what it is when you issue a bond, you could have it rated to see if it meets certain GHG reduction goals. And if it does, then it's more highly rated in the market. And so, I mean, I don't think that SCC wants to get in the business of doing something that's not a green bond. And so we are self-imposing that on ourselves. I will also mention that debt service 5% number that's in there. It's ultra conservative. It's recommended for new agencies or new industries like the CCAs. And so it's designed to give the market, I guess, confidence in SCCP and other CCAs that we're not over leveraging ourselves. And it is designed, we did look at a few other similar agencies where most of their cost is in one area, like you mentioned, for us, like most of our non-energy is a very tiny part of our budget. So that 5% is structured similarly to take advantage of just a humongous cost for SCCP. Try to be conservative with that.
And so great, thank you for the feedback, Councilmember Parent. And so we'll certainly do some more analyses and more narrative as we draft the actual policy, which I think is really important. One of the things that we've talked about as a finance team, and Karen and I have spoken about this briefly as well, we really want to make sure that we're conservative from a standpoint that we don't put ourselves in a position of whatever. I think that's really important, particularly for a young CCA such as ours. And in terms of interest rates and what others outside of government might have access to, we're in a pretty interesting interest rate environment right now. So the point that you make about access to non-government agencies, access to IRA funding is a really valid point, because there's pretty significant dollars out there, and they can take advantage of that, which might put them on par with the rates that we as a public agency might also be able to pursue. So that's a really good point. So we'll certainly take that back and do some analysis and discussion around that and see where that might fit in with the actual debt policy.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I guess honestly, it probably doesn't really impact whether or not, or what our policy looks like. We should have one, even if we don't feel like we're immediately competitive, right? But I do want that to maybe that informs whether or not we actually are, and we want to take on debt and go out and do things, after it's done.
So thank you for those.
Yeah, no, I had a question, but you answered it. Mine was more in line with the discretion that we have of, the debt that we acquire with new agencies. I was wondering how we are comparable to other newer agencies, but you answered that question quite well. So it's good to know that there's a reasoning behind us being ultra conservative, and that in the future, perhaps maybe we could look at a different set of alternatives if we so choose, but maybe once we're solid.
And that's a really good point, Madam Chair. So thanks for raising that as well. So one of the things that we also intend to build into our policies is that we'll do an annual review for that very reason. Are we too conservative in terms of managing our revenue? or are we not conservative enough? That would be an opportunity for us to revisit those policies and make adjustments accordingly. Again, all feeding into ultimately pursuing credit, investment grade credit rating, on which any bond issuance would be tested against to measure in terms of rating those instruments. Thank you for those
Great.
remarks.
Thank you all very much for the presentations. Concludes the items on the agenda. Next, we have any committee member announcements. Any online?
Hands raised.
Okay, great. Well, that concludes our meeting. This meeting is adjourned.
Right.
That was easy.
Right.